The letter sat wedged between two rocks near the creek, its edges already curling from the mountain mist, and Zachary Parrish plucked it free with fingers calloused from a decade of trapping beaver and hunting elk in these Colorado mountains. He had come down from his cabin above Animas Forks in September of 1878 to check his traps, not expecting to find words written in careful script on paper that looked like it had been torn from a journal. The handwriting was small and precise, feminine, and as he unfolded the damp page, he realized it was addressed to no one at all. "Dear someone," it began, "I do not know if anyone will ever read these words, but I must write them or go mad from the silence. Today, I watched the aspens turn gold on the mountainside and thought how beautiful it would be to share this sight with another soul who might understand why such things matter. My father says I am foolish for caring about trees and sunsets when there is work to be done. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I am foolish, but I cannot help myself." Zachary stood in the creek bed, water rushing past his boots, and read every word twice. The letter was signed simply B and dated 3 days prior. He looked around the rocky landscape, the steep slopes rising on either side of the narrow valley, where Animas Forks sat like a handful of buildings scattered among the peaks. Someone had left this here intentionally, had placed it where the water might carry it away, or where it might simply dissolve into pulp. Someone wanted to be heard but expected no answer. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it inside his leather jacket, next to his heart, and continued checking his traps. But his mind kept returning to those words, to the loneliness that echoed in every sentence. Zachary knew loneliness well. He had lived alone in these mountains for 10 years, since he was 20 years old, and he had grown accustomed to his own company. But this letter made him remember what it felt like to want connection, to crave understanding from another human being. That night, in his cabin built of logs he had hewn himself, he lit a candle and read the letter again. Then he took out paper he kept for making notes about his trap lines and began to write. "Dear B," he wrote, his hand awkward with the pen after so many months without using one. "I found your letter by the creek below Animas Forks. I read every word. You are not foolish for caring about aspens and sunsets. Anyone who cannot see beauty in this world is the true fool. I have lived in these mountains for 10 years and I still stop to watch the light change on the peaks. I still listen to the elk bugle in autumn and feel something in my chest that has no name. You are not alone in seeing these things, even if you feel alone." He signed it, ZP. And the next morning, he hiked down to the creek and placed the letter in the same spot where he had found hers, weighted down with a smooth river stone. 3 days later, he found her reply. "Dear ZP," she had written, and he could feel the excitement in her script, the way the letters leaned forward as if rushing to meet him. "I cannot believe someone found my letter. I cannot believe someone wrote back. I have been checking the creek every day, hoping, and when I saw your words I actually cried. My name is Beatrice Lawson. I live in Animas Forks with my father and 3 brothers. We came here 2 years ago when my father heard about the silver mines. I am 19 years old and I have never felt more invisible than I do in this town. Everyone is so focused on extracting wealth from the mountains that no one sees the mountains themselves. But you see them. You understand. Please write back again. Please let me know I am not imagining this." Zachary sat on a boulder and read her words 3 times. Beatrice. Her name was Beatrice. He tried to picture her, this woman who wrote letters to no one, who cared about aspens and sunsets. Animas Forks was small enough that he probably knew her by sight, though he rarely went into town. When he did, he bought his supplies quickly and left, uncomfortable with the noise and the press of people after months alone. He wrote back that same day, telling her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands, about the way the first snow looked on the high peaks. He told her things he had never told anyone, about how he had come west after his parents died of fever in Kansas, how he had found peace in the wilderness that he had never known in civilization. He told her she was not imagining anything, that her letters mattered to him, that he would read every word she wanted to write. The letters became a rhythm, a pattern woven into both their lives. Every 3 or 4 days, one of them would leave a letter at the creek, and the other would find it and respond. Zachary learned that Beatrice had been educated at a school for girls in St. Louis before her father's business failed, and he moved the family west to start over. She had loved learning, loved books and poetry and history, but her father considered such things frivolous now that they were mining people. Her mother had died when Beatrice was 12, and she kept house for her father and brothers, cooking and cleaning and mending. Her hands always busy with practical things while her mind starved for beauty and meaning. She learned that Zachary had grown up on a farm, the youngest of 5 sons, and that he had always felt out of place among people who seemed content with ordinary life. He told her about the first time he saw the Rocky Mountains, how something in his soul had recognized them, had known he belonged among those peaks. He described the wildlife he encountered, the harsh winters he endured, the satisfaction of living by his own strength and skill. His letters were longer than hers, his handwriting rough but readable, and he found himself thinking of things to tell her all through his days. October arrived and the aspens blazed gold across the mountainsides. Beatrice wrote about watching them from the window of her father's cabin, about how the color seemed almost unreal in its intensity. Zachary wrote back describing the same aspens from higher up the mountain, how they looked like rivers of gold flowing down the valleys. They were watching the same beauty from different angles, and somehow that made it more beautiful still. "I want to meet you," Beatrice wrote in late October. "Is that too bold? I know it is improper, but these letters have become the most important part of my life. I feel like I know you better than I know anyone, even my own family. Would you think less of me if I said I dream about what you look like? All I know is that you have hands calloused from work and that you must be strong to survive alone in the mountains. But I want to see your face. I want to hear your voice speaking the words you write." Zachary held that letter for 2 days before responding. He was afraid, he realized, afraid that if they met, she would be disappointed. He was 30 years old, weathered by sun and wind, his face marked by a scar along his jaw from a hunting accident years ago. His hair hung past his shoulders because he only cut it once or twice a year. His body was hard muscle from constant physical labor, his hands rough and scarred. He was not a civilized man anymore. He was not the kind of man an educated woman from St. Louis should want, but he wanted to see her too. He wanted it so badly his chest ached. "I want to meet you too," he finally wrote, "but you should know what you would be getting. I am not a town man, Beatrice. I am rough and hard from mountain living. I do not have fancy clothes or refined manners. I am just a trapper who lives alone and talks to himself too much. If you want to meet me anyway, I will be at the creek at sunrise on November 1st. If you change your mind, I will understand. I will keep writing to you either way, for as long as you want me to." November 1st dawned cold and clear, frost glittering on the rocks. Zachary reached the creek as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky pink and gold. He had washed in the creek the night before, cut his hair a bit though it still touched his shoulders, put on his cleanest shirt. His heart hammered in his chest like he was facing down a grizzly bear, instead of meeting a woman who had been writing to him for 2 months. He saw her coming down the path from town, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair pulled back from her face. She was small, he realized, delicate-boned and fine-featured, and for a moment his courage failed. What was he doing? She would take one look at him and run. But then she saw him and her face transformed. She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. She walked faster and he moved toward her, and they met in the middle of the creek bed, water rushing past their feet. "Zachary," she said, and hearing his name in her voice made something in his chest crack open. "Beatrice," he answered, and they just looked at each other. She was beautiful, but not in the way he had imagined. She had strong features, dark eyes that looked directly into his without shyness, a wide mouth that seemed ready to smile or speak her mind. She was not delicate at all, he realized. She just looked that way next to him because he was 6 feet 4 inches of muscle and bone, broad-shouldered and thick-armed from years of swinging an axe and hauling traps. But there was steel in her, he could see it in her eyes. "You are real," she said softly. "I was half afraid I had invented you." "I am real," he confirmed. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "And you are more than I expected." "Is that good or bad?" "Good," he said. "So good I do not have words for it." They talked for hours, standing in the creek bed as the sun rose higher and the frost melted from the rocks. Everything was easier in person, the words flowing between them like the water at their feet. She told him about her frustration with her life, about how she felt trapped in a town full of people who cared only about silver and money. He told her about the loneliness that sometimes overwhelmed him in winter, when the snow was too deep to leave his cabin for weeks at a time. "Why did you read my first letter?" she asked. "You could have just left it there." "I found something someone had lost," he said, "or so I thought. Seemed wrong not to read it." "I am glad you did," she said. "I am glad you wrote back. I will keep writing back," he promised. "Always." They met again 3 days later, and 3 days after that. Each meeting lasted longer than the one before. Zachary found himself making excuses to come down from the mountain, to walk with Beatrice along the creek, or sit with her on the sunny side of a boulder, talking and talking. She made him laugh, which was something he rarely did. She challenged his ideas, argued with him about books she had read, asked him endless questions about the wildlife and the mountains. She was curious about everything, hungry for knowledge and experience. "Take me up to your cabin," she said in mid-November, after they had been meeting for 2 weeks. Zachary hesitated. "That would not be proper." "None of this is proper," she pointed out. "I am meeting a mountain man in secret, unchaperoned. My father would lock me in the cellar if he knew. But I do not care about proper anymore. I care about living. I care about seeing things that matter. Please, Zachary, show me where you live." So he took her up the mountain, matching his pace to hers, pointing out animal tracks in the snow that had fallen during the night. She was stronger than he expected, climbing steadily without complaint, even though the altitude made her breathe hard. His cabin sat in a small meadow surrounded by spruce and pine, smoke rising from the chimney because he had banked the fire before leaving that morning. She stood in the doorway, looking around at the single room he called home. It was rough but clean, the floor swept, his few possessions organized neatly. A bearskin covered the bed in the corner. Snowshoes and traps hung on the walls. Books lined a shelf he had built, not many, but a few he had carried with him from Kansas and others he had acquired over the years. "You have books," she said, crossing to the shelf immediately. "Not as many as you would like, probably." She ran her fingers over the spines. "Shakespeare, Milton." "A Bible, Walden, you have Thoreau." She turned to look at him. "You are full of surprises, Zachary Parrish." "I can read," he said, a little defensive. "Just because I live in the mountains does not mean I am ignorant." "I never thought you were ignorant," she said. I just did not expect to find Thoreau in a trapper's cabin." He showed her around, explaining how he survived through the winter, where he kept his supplies, how he had built the cabin to withstand the fierce storms that blew through the high country. She asked questions about everything, genuinely interested, and he found himself talking more than he had in years. She made him feel like his life mattered, like the things he knew and the way he lived had value. "It is beautiful here," she said finally, standing at the window and looking out at the mountains rising all around them. "Lonely but beautiful." "It has been lonely," he admitted, coming to stand beside her, "but less so since I found your first letter." She turned to look up at him. She was so small next to him, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder, but when she looked at him, he did not feel like a giant. He felt like a man looking at a woman who saw him clearly, all of him, and did not turn away. "I think I am falling in love with you," she said quietly. "Is that insane? We have only known each other a few weeks." "We have known each other 2 months," he corrected. "Through letters. And I think I started falling in love with you the moment I read your first one, so if you are insane, then so am I." He bent his head and kissed her, gentle at first because he was afraid of his own strength, afraid of overwhelming her. But she rose on her toes and kissed him back fiercely, her hands gripping his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her and lifted her right off her feet. She laughed against his mouth, and the sound filled all the empty places in his chest. They spent hours in his cabin that day, talking and kissing and making plans that seemed both impossible and inevitable. She had to go back to town before dark or her father would ask questions. But she promised to return, and he promised to keep meeting her, and they both knew they were heading towards something that would change everything. Winter came hard to the mountains. By late November, snow lay 3 feet deep around Zachary's cabin, and the temperature dropped below 0 at night. He still met Beatrice at the creek when he could, but the trips down the mountain grew more difficult and dangerous. She had told her father she was walking for exercise, but the excuse was wearing thin as the weather worsened. "He wants me to marry the assayer in town," she told Zachary one December morning, her breath fogging in the frigid air. "Mr. Henderson. He is 40 years old and has been married twice before. Both wives died in childbirth. But my father says it is a good match, that Mr. Henderson has money and prospects." Zachary felt rage rise in his chest, hot and fierce. "You cannot marry him." "I do not intend to," she said, "but I do not know how to refuse without telling my father the truth. And if I tell him about you, about us, he will forbid me from seeing you. He will lock me in the house. I know him, Zachary. He will not tolerate disobedience." "Then come live with me," Zachary said. The words were out before he could think them through. "Marry me instead. Come up to the cabin and stay. We can survive the winter together." She stared at him. "Are you serious?" "I have never been more serious about anything in my life," he said. He took her hands in his, her fingers small and cold inside his large, rough palms. "I love you, Beatrice. I want you with me. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to show you every beautiful thing in these mountains. I want to read books with you by the fire and listen to you talk about whatever you are thinking. I want all of it. I want you." Tears streaked down her face, freezing on her cheeks. "I love you too, I want all of that. But Zachary, are you sure? Living up there in winter is so hard. You said yourself you get snowed in for weeks at a time. What if you get tired of me? What if I cannot handle it?" "You can handle it," he said with certainty. "You are the strongest woman I have ever met, and I will never get tired of you. Never." "Then yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." They made their plans quickly. There was a circuit preacher who came through Anima's Forks once a month, and he was due to arrive in 2 days. Beatrice would tell her father she was going to a friend's house to help with sewing. then meet Zachary in town. They would find the preacher, get married, and go up to the cabin before anyone knew what had happened. It was not perfect, but it was the best they could do. Zachary spent the next 2 days preparing. He hunted and brought down an elk, butchering it and storing the meat in the lean-to he had built against the north wall of the cabin where it would stay frozen all winter. He stocked extra firewood. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly, making room for Beatrice's things even though he did not know what she would bring. He was nervous and excited, his heart racing every time he thought about her living with him, sharing his life. On the appointed day, he went down to Anima's Forks and waited near the general store. The town was small, just a collection of buildings huddled in the narrow valley, surrounded by peaks that seemed to touch the sky. Miners moved through the streets, their faces grim with cold and exhaustion. It was a hard life, pulling silver from the mountains, and most of them would not last more than a few years before moving on or dying. Beatrice appeared from between 2 buildings, carrying a canvas bag. She wore her heavy coat and boots, and her face was pale but determined. She ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, holding her close. "Did anyone see you?" he asked. "I do not think so," she said. "My father was at the mine. My brothers were all working. I left a note saying I had gone to help Mrs. Donovan with her new baby and would be back tomorrow. By the time they realize I am not there, we will already be married and up at the cabin." They found the preacher at the boarding house, eating a late breakfast. He was an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face, and he did not ask too many questions when Zachary explained they wanted to be married right away. He agreed to perform the ceremony in the small church at the edge of town, a rough building that doubled as a schoolhouse during the week. The wedding took less than 15 minutes. There were no witnesses except the preacher and a miner's wife who happened to be cleaning the church. Beatrice's hand trembled in Zachary's as they spoke their vows, promising to love and honor each other for as long as they lived. When the preacher told Zachary he could kiss his bride, he did so gently, reverently, aware that everything had just changed. She was his wife now. He was her husband. They belonged to each other. They climbed to the cabin through snow that was falling thick and soft, covering their tracks almost as fast as they made them. Beatrice struggled in places where the snow was deep, and Zachary ended up carrying her and her bag the last mile, his strength making easy work of what would have been impossible for most men. She laughed, clinging to his neck, her face buried against his shoulder. "My husband the giant," she teased. "My wife the featherweight," he responded, and she laughed again. He carried her over the threshold of the cabin, setting her down gently by the fire. The cabin was warm, the fire crackling cheerfully, and it felt different now that she was here to stay. It felt like a home instead of just a shelter. That night, they consummated their marriage in the bed he had built with his own hands, under the bearskin that had kept him warm through countless lonely winters. Beatrice was shy at first, and Zachary was careful with her, mindful of his size and strength. But there was joy in their joining and tenderness, and afterward they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. "I am yours now," she whispered. "And I am yours," he answered. "Always." 3 days later, there was pounding on the cabin door. Zachary opened it to find Beatrice's father and 2 of her brothers standing in the snow, their faces red with cold and anger. James Lawson was a big man, thick-bodied and strong from mine work, and he looked like he wanted to kill someone. "Where is my daughter?" he demanded. Beatrice appeared at Zachary's side. "I am here, father." "Get your things," James ordered. "You are coming home right now." "No," Beatrice said quietly. "I am home. This is my home now. Zachary is my husband. We were married 3 days ago by Preacher Williams." The color drained from James's face, then flooded back darker than before. "You what? You married this mountain savage without my permission?" "Without even telling me." "You would not have given permission," Beatrice said, and Zachary could hear her voice shaking, but she did not back down. "You would have locked me up and forced me to marry Mr. Henderson. So yes, I married Zachary without telling you, and I am not sorry." James took a step forward, and Zachary moved to block him, his body a wall between the older man and Beatrice. He did not speak, just stood there, and after a moment James seemed to realize that any physical confrontation would end badly for him. Zachary was younger, bigger and harder than any mine worker, his body honed by a decade of mountain survival. "You are making a mistake," James said to Beatrice, his voice tight with fury. "You think this is romantic, living in the wilderness with a man who has nothing. Wait until you are starving next winter. Wait until you are sick or hurt and there is no doctor for miles. Wait until you realize you have thrown your life away on a man who cannot even provide you with a proper house." "I can provide for her," Zachary said, his voice low and steady. "I have lived in these mountains for 10 years and never gone hungry. I have survived blizzards and predators and everything else this country can throw at a man. I will take care of your daughter. I will protect her with my life, and I will love her every day for the rest of my days." "Love," James spat the word like a curse. "Love does not put food on the table." "No," Zachary agreed, "but skill and strength do, and I have both." They stood in tense silence, the wind howling around the cabin. Finally, James turned away. "You are dead to me," he said to Beatrice without looking at her. "You want to live like an animal in the mountains, fine. But do not come crying to me when you realize what you have done." He left, his sons following, and Beatrice stood in the doorway watching them disappear into the snow. She was shaking, and when Zachary touched her shoulder, she turned and buried her face against his chest, crying. He held her, his big hands gentle on her back, and let her grieve for the family she had lost. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "Do not be," she answered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I chose this. I chose you. I would choose you again." Winter deepened. The snow piled higher and higher until the cabin was almost buried and the world outside became a white wilderness where nothing moved except the wind. They were completely cut off from the town, from everyone, and it did not matter. They had each other. Beatrice adapted to mountain life faster than Zachary had dared hope. She learned to cook over the fire, to make bread from their dwindling supplies of flour, to stretch every bit of food as far as it would go. She helped him maintain the cabin, stuffing moss and cloth into cracks where wind leaked through, keeping the fire going while he was out checking traps. She was not afraid of work, not afraid of hardship. She had spent 2 years keeping house for her father and brothers, and she was practical and resourceful. But more than that, she thrived in the beauty of their isolation. She stood at the window for hours, watching the way the light changed on the snow, how the icicles grew and shrank with the temperature. She made Zachary tell her the names of all the peaks she could see, the names of the trees and birds and animals. She read his small collection of books over and over, then demanded he tell her stories from his life, from his childhood, from his 10 years alone. "I want to know everything about you," she said one night as they lay in bed, the fire burning low. "Tell me something you have never told anyone." He thought for a moment. "I was afraid," he said finally, "when I first came to these mountains. Everyone thought I was brave, heading off into the wilderness alone, but I was terrified. I did not know if I could survive. I did not know if I was strong enough or smart enough. I almost turned back a dozen times that first year." "But you did not," she said. "No," he agreed, "because I was more afraid of living a life I did not want than I was of dying out here." "That is the bravest thing I have ever heard," she whispered. They talked like that every night, sharing their histories, their fears, their dreams. They made love frequently, learning each other's bodies, finding comfort and pleasure in their physical connection. And they planned for the future, for the life they would build together. In February, when the worst of the winter had passed but the snow was still deep, Beatrice woke up sick. She barely made it outside before vomiting, and when she came back in, pale and shaking, Zachary wrapped her in blankets and made her tea. "Must have been something I ate," she said. But it kept happening, morning after morning, and finally she looked at him with wide eyes. "Zachary, I think I might be with child." He stared at her, his mind racing. A baby. They were going to have a baby. Joy and terror hit him simultaneously. "Are you sure?" "Not completely," she admitted. "But the signs are there, and it would make sense. We have not exactly been careful." He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," she said honestly, "but happy too. I want your children, Zachary. I want a family with you. I just wish we had a doctor nearby, and that my father had not disowned me, and that we had more supplies." And he kissed her, silencing her worries. "We will figure it out," he promised. "We always do." As winter gave way to spring, Beatrice's pregnancy became undeniable. Her belly swelled, and she bloomed with health despite the hardships of mountain life. Zachary became fiercely protective, refusing to let her do anything strenuous, hunting and trapping with renewed determination to build up their stores before the baby came. In April, when the snow finally began to melt and the trails became passable, he made the trip down to Anima's Forks to buy supplies. He used money he had saved from selling furs, purchasing flour and sugar and fabric for baby clothes. The shopkeeper, a friendly man named Tom who had always been civil to Zachary, mentioned that Beatrice's father had been asking about her. "He wants to know if she is alive," Tom said quietly. "I think he regrets what he said. Pride keeps him from coming up to your place, but he asks about her every time I see him." Zachary considered this. "Tell him she is well," he said finally. "Tell him she is happy, and tell him he has a grandchild coming in the fall." When he told Beatrice, she cried. "Do you think he will come see us?" "I do not know," Zachary admitted, "but at least he will know you are all right." The summer was glorious. They worked together to plant a garden near the cabin, coaxing vegetables from the rocky soil. Zachary taught Beatrice to fish, and she proved to be better at it than he was, her patience outlasting his every time. Her belly grew round and full, and at night Zachary would place his hand on it and feel their child moving inside her, kicking and rolling. "He is strong," Zachary said one evening, feeling a particularly vigorous kick. "Or she is," Beatrice countered. "Do not assume it will be a boy." "I do not care either way," he said honestly, "as long as you both survive." That was his deepest fear, the one that kept him awake at night. Women died in childbirth all the time, especially out here where there were no doctors. He had seen it happen, had known men who lost their wives and babies. The thought of losing Beatrice made him feel sick with dread. She seemed to sense his worry. "I am strong," she reminded him. "You said so yourself. I will be fine. We will both be fine. Promise me," he said. "I cannot promise that," she said gently. "No one can, but I will fight with everything I have to come back to you." In early September, her labor began. Zachary had prepared as best he could, boiling water and gathering clean cloths, but when her contractions started in earnest, he realized how helpless he was. There was nothing he could do but hold her hand and wipe her forehead and tell her she was doing well. The labor lasted 18 hours. Beatrice screamed and cried and cursed him, and he took it all, feeling like each of her pains was a knife in his own gut. He had faced down grizzly bears without flinching, had survived avalanches and blizzards, but watching his wife suffer and being unable to help was the hardest thing he had ever endured. Finally, as dawn broke on the second day, the baby came. Zachary caught his son in his own hands, this tiny, perfect human covered in blood and vernix, and he started crying. The baby cried too, a strong, angry wail, and Beatrice laughed weakly from the bed. "Is he healthy?" she asked. "He is perfect," Zachary managed, his voice breaking. "You are perfect. You did it, Beatrice. You did it." He cleaned the baby and wrapped him in soft cloth, then placed him in Beatrice's arms. She looked exhausted, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her face pale. But she smiled down at their son with such love that Zachary's heart felt too big for his chest. "What should we name him?" she asked. "You choose," Zachary said. She thought for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "After my grandfather, he was a good man, Thomas Parrish." "Thomas Parrish," Zachary repeated. "It is a strong name." They spent the next weeks in a haze of exhaustion and wonder. Thomas was a good baby, strong and healthy, nursing well and sleeping in stretches long enough that his parents could sleep too. Zachary found himself spending hours just watching his son, marveling at his tiny fingers and toes, his perfect little face. He had never expected to be a father, had never imagined he would have a family, and the reality of it overwhelmed him. Beatrice recovered quickly, her strength returning day by day. She took to motherhood naturally, caring for Thomas with a competence that amazed Zachary. She sang to the baby, talked to him constantly, and insisted Zachary do the same. "He needs to hear your voice," she said. "He needs to know his father." In late September, there was a knock on the cabin door. Zachary opened it to find James Lawson standing there alone, looking older and more tired than he had months ago. He held a package wrapped in brown paper. "I came to see my daughter and my grandson," James said without preamble. Zachary stepped aside, and James entered the cabin. Beatrice stood by the fire, holding Thomas, and for a long moment father and daughter just looked at each other. "You look well," James said finally. "I am well," Beatrice answered. "Better than I have ever been." James crossed to her and looked down at the baby. His face softened, and he reached out one rough finger to touch Thomas's cheek. "He is a fine boy." "He is," Beatrice agreed. "I was wrong," James said, the words clearly difficult for him. "I was angry and proud, and I said things I should not have said. You are my daughter. You will always be my daughter, and I do not want to miss knowing my grandson because I am too stubborn to admit when I am wrong." Beatrice started crying. "I missed you, Father." They embraced awkwardly, the baby between them, and Zachary saw James's shoulders shake. The older man was crying too. The package James had brought contained baby clothes that Beatrice's mother had made for her when she was born, carefully preserved all these years. There was also a quilt, sewn by hand, and a silver rattle that had belonged to James's father. Beatrice held each item like it was treasure, tears streaming down her face. James did not stay long, but before he left, he shook Zachary's hand. "You take care of them," he said. "I will," Zachary promised. "Always." After that, James came to visit once a month, bringing supplies and news from town. He never said he had been wrong about Zachary, but his actions spoke louder than words. He brought them a milk cow in the spring, a crate of chickens in the summer. He taught Zachary better techniques for preserving meat. Slowly, awkwardly, they built something like friendship. The years passed. Thomas grew from baby to toddler to little boy, strong and curious and fearless like his father. Beatrice gave birth to a daughter when Thomas was 3, a tiny girl with dark hair and her mother's eyes. They named her Alina, and she was quieter than her brother, more thoughtful, but just as loved. 2 years after Alina came another son, James, named for Beatrice's father. The old man cried when they told him, and he doted on his namesake shamelessly. Life in the mountains was hard but good. Zachary expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the children, building a larger lean-to for supplies. He taught Thomas to hunt and trap, to read the weather and the land. Beatrice taught Alina and James to read and write, using the books from Zachary's shelf and any others they could acquire. She wrote stories for the children, tales of adventure and magic, and they begged for them every night. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Beatrice and Zachary would sit together and remember how they had met. She would tease him about finding her first letter, about how he could have just left it there. "But you did not," she would say. "You read it. You wrote back." "Of course I did," he would answer. "It was the most important letter I ever found." They kept writing letters to each other even though they lived together, silly romantic notes that they would hide for each other to find. Zachary would leave one tucked into her sewing basket, telling her how beautiful she was. She would slip one into his coat pocket, telling him how much she loved him. It became their private language, their way of saying things that felt too big to just speak aloud. When Thomas was 10, Beatrice found she was pregnant again. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and she was sick much of the time. Zachary worried constantly, but she insisted she was fine. "I have done this 3 times before," she reminded him. "I know what I am doing." The baby, another girl they named Rose, was born healthy and strong on a snowy December night. Beatrice was 32 by then, and Zachary was 43, and they looked at this latest daughter and felt their family was complete. James Lawson lived to see all 4 of his grandchildren, dying peacefully in his sleep when he was 68. Beatrice grieved deeply, but she was grateful for the years they had reconciled, for the relationship her father had built with her children. They buried him in the small cemetery in Animas Forks, and the whole town came to the funeral because he had been well liked despite his rough edges. The children grew. Thomas became a young man, tall and broad like his father, and eventually he married a girl from a neighboring valley. He built his own cabin not far from Zachary and Beatrice, and they had grandchildren to spoil. Alina proved to be brilliant, teaching school in Animas Forks and eventually writing books that were published back east. James became a doctor, studying in Denver and then returning to the mountains to serve the people there. Rose, the youngest, stayed close to home, helping her parents as they aged and eventually inheriting the cabin. Zachary and Beatrice grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and richer with each passing year. They still wrote letters to each other, still found ways to say "I love you" in 100 different ways. On their 40th wedding anniversary, Zachary took Beatrice down to the creek where he had found her first letter. It was summer, and the aspens were green and full, the water rushing clear and cold over the rocks. He pulled a letter from his pocket, old and yellowed, the ink faded. "I kept it," he said, handing it to her. "Your first letter, the one that changed my life." She unfolded it carefully, reading the words she had written so long ago. "Dear someone," she read aloud, and her voice was soft with memory. "I do not know if anyone will ever read these words, but I must write them or go mad from the silence." "I am glad I read them," Zachary said. "I am glad I wrote back." "So am I," she said, and she kissed him there by the creek, under the aspens in the place where their story had begun. They lived many more years, watching their children and grandchildren grow, seeing Animas Forks change as the silver ran out and people moved away. The town that had once been bustling became a ghost town, just a handful of buildings slowly being reclaimed by the mountains. But Zachary and Beatrice stayed, and their family stayed, and the cabin in the high meadow remained a home full of love and laughter. When Zachary was 71, he got sick. It was pneumonia, and despite James's best efforts, despite all the medicine and care they could provide, his lungs filled with fluid and his strong body finally failed. He died in his bed, in the cabin he had built with his own hands, with Beatrice holding his hand and his children and grandchildren gathered around him. "I love you," Beatrice whispered to him as he took his last breath. "I will love you always." She lived 3 more years without him, surrounded by family but achingly lonely for the man who had been her partner for more than 4 decades. She spent her days writing, filling journal after journal with memories of their life together, with stories for her grandchildren, with letters to Zachary that no one would read, but that she wrote anyway because she had to. On a sunny morning in September, Rose found her in her chair by the window, a letter in her lap, a smile on her face. She had died peacefully in her sleep, and the letter she had been writing was to Zachary. "My dearest love," it read, "I have written you so many letters over the years. You always read every word. You always wrote back. I do not know if you can read this one, wherever you are, but I have to believe that somehow you will. I have to believe that I will see you again, that this is not the end of our story but just another chapter. Wait for me, my love. I am coming home." They buried her next to Zachary on a hillside overlooking the valley, under the aspens that turned gold every autumn. Their children placed a single stone marker for both of them, with their names and dates and a simple inscription. He read every word. He wrote back always. And they loved each other until the end. Years later, long after everyone who had known them personally was gone, hikers sometimes found letters tucked among the rocks near the creek below the abandoned town of Anima's Forks. They were copies, written by grandchildren and great-grandchildren who wanted to honor the story of how their family began. The letters told of a lonely woman who wrote to no one, and a mountain man who found her words and made them matter. They told of love that grew from letters into a lifetime, of a family built on words and faith and courage. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light turned golden on the peaks, if you listened carefully near that creek, you might almost hear voices. A woman laughing, a man speaking softly. The sound of love that had lasted beyond death, beyond time, echoing forever in the mountains they had called home. The cabin stood for many years after they were gone, maintained by descendants who understood its significance. It became a symbol of endurance and devotion, a testament to what could be built when 2 people chose each other against all odds. Inside, on a shelf that had once held Zachary's few precious books, visitors could see letters preserved in glass cases. Letters written in 2 different hands, one rough and large, one small and precise, telling the story of a love that had started with words on paper and had grown into something that death itself could not diminish. The mountains remained, eternal and beautiful, and the creek still ran clear and cold over the rocks. The aspens still turned gold in autumn, and the snow still fell deep in winter. And if you went to that place, to that creek where it all began, you might feel something in the air, a presence, a warmth, the sense that you were standing on holy ground, in a place where 2 souls had recognized each other across the distance, and had refused to let anything keep them apart. Beatrice had written letters no one would read, casting her words into the void like prayers or wishes. But Zachary had found them. He had read every word, and he had written her back always without fail for more than 40 years. Their children inherited that legacy, that understanding that words mattered, that communication was sacred, that love required both speaking and listening. Thomas told his children about finding his parents sitting together in the cabin, reading old letters to each other, and laughing at things they had written decades before. Alina wrote in her books about the power of words to bridge loneliness, to create connection where none had existed. James talked about how his father had taught him that strength was not just physical, that the strongest thing a man could do was be vulnerable enough to love completely. Rose kept the cabin exactly as her parents had left it, a shrine to their memory, and she told their story to anyone who would listen. The legacy spread beyond their immediate family. In the small communities scattered through the Colorado mountains, the story of the letter-writing lovers became legend. Young women who felt trapped by circumstance found hope in Beatrice's courage. Young men who felt disconnected from civilized society saw in Zachary an example of how isolation did not have to mean loneliness, how strength could be gentle, how a hard life could still be full of beauty and love. Some people said it was just a story, that it had been embellished over the years, that real love could not possibly be that perfect. But the letters existed, hundreds of them, proof that every word was true. They had been ordinary people who had found something extraordinary, not because they were special, but because they had been willing to be honest and brave and vulnerable with each other. As decades passed and the 19th century gave way to the 20th, and then the 21st, the story remained. It was told in books and articles. Historians studied the letters, marveling at their eloquence and intimacy. Tourists came to Animas Forks, now a registered ghost town, and hiked up to the cabin to see where it had all happened. Some of them were couples, looking for inspiration for their own relationships. Some were writers, hoping to capture some of that magic in their own work. Some were simply lonely people who needed to believe that connection was possible, that love could triumph over isolation and hardship. And every single one of them left with the same understanding, that love was not about grand gestures or perfect circumstances. It was about showing up, about reading every word, even when it would have been easier to look away, about writing back always, even when you were tired or scared or uncertain, about choosing each other every single day and building a life word by word, moment by moment, letter by letter. The creek still flowed, just as it had that day in 1878 when Zachary Parrish found a letter wedged between two rocks and made the decision to read it. The water was clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the high peaks, and it would keep flowing long after everyone who remembered the story was gone. But the story itself would remain, carried forward by the letters that had started it all, by the descendants who honored their memory, and by every person who heard it and recognized something true and eternal in those simple words. He read every word. He wrote her back always. And they loved each other until the end. That was how it happened, how a mountain man and a lonely woman found each other through words on paper and built a love that lasted a lifetime. It was a story of courage and faith, of choosing connection over safety, of believing that someone out there would understand. And because Zachary had read, because he had written back, because they had both been brave enough to meet and strong enough to stay, they created something that would outlive them both. Their story was not about escaping hardship or finding an easy path. Life in the Colorado mountains in the late 1800s was brutal and unforgiving, and they faced every challenge that came with it. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. They proved that love was not about perfect circumstances, but about perfect commitment, not about having everything, but about being everything to each other. And so the letters remained, carefully preserved, a record of two hearts that had found each other against impossible odds and had refused to let go. They were a promise to future generations that connection was possible, that loneliness could be overcome, that words had power to change lives. Every letter Zachary wrote back to Beatrice was an act of faith, a declaration that she mattered, that her thoughts and feelings were worthy of attention and response. Every letter Beatrice wrote to him was an act of trust, a willingness to be known fully and completely. That was what made their story so powerful and so enduring. Not that they had lived in the mountains or survived hardships or raised a family in difficult circumstances, but that they had truly seen each other, had truly listened, had truly loved. And in doing so, they had created something beautiful and lasting that would inspire countless others to do the same. The sun set over the mountains of Colorado, painting the peaks gold and purple and rose. The aspens rustled in the evening breeze, their leaves shimmering like coins. And in the cabin on the hillside, empty now but still standing strong, you could almost feel their presence. Zachary, tall and strong and gentle, his hands rough from work but tender in love. Beatrice, small and fierce and brilliant, her words like bridges spanning the distance between souls. They were gone, but they were not forgotten. They would never be forgotten. Because they had written it all down, every moment of love and struggle and joy, and their words remained as proof that love like theirs was real and possible and worth fighting for. Always.